Today on the Ministry Coach podcast, we'll be interviewing an expert and coach on emotional intelligence. She's going to teach us how to leverage that to increase our influence in leadership. And she just happens to be my sister, Elise Boggs Morales.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Ministry Coach podcast, where you get weekly tips and tactics to help you fast track the growth and health of your youth ministry. I am Jeff Lascola, and with me as always is Kristen Lascola, but also your sister, Elise Boggs Morales.
Whoa!
How awesome! It's a family affair.
Sing double.
Thanks so much for being with us today, Elise.
I love it.
So Elise is not only my sister, which is very exciting to get to have her on our podcast, but she is a leadership professor, an EQ certified consultant and coach. So she lives, breathes, eats, and sleeps EQ, which is so exciting because that's huge right now. Huge buzzword, huge leadership I guess, training that you do all the time. Mm-hmm. Like, this is what she does for a living. And so I thought, wow, this would be great to have her on the podcast because we work with leaders and we're always trying to be better as leaders. And so I said, hey, can you come on and tell us a little bit about what you do and how that applies to leadership and pastorship and ministry? Because Elise actually used to work in full-time ministry as well at the church that I work at right now. And she worked with young adults and she worked with the leadership network there. And so she's well-versed in what it takes to actually pull off ministry too. She's not just in the business world, but she does own her own business. You can find her at eliseboggsconsulting.com and check out everything she has going on there.
Is it eliseboggsconsulting.com or eliseboggs.com?
It is eliseboggs.com.
Oh!
However,
someone's going to buy it.
Called Elise Boggs Consulting.
There we go.
So it's all right.
We're both right.
It's all good. You're both right.
Oh, man, that was a close one. All right. So, Elise, we want our listeners to walk away tonight or today, whenever you're listening. We're filming at night. It's very late. We want our listeners to walk away knowing why they cannot overlook the importance of EQ when it comes to their leadership and how that has actually everything to do with their rating as a leader and how to go far in that way. So tell us, how do we become better leaders? How do we start to incorporate EQ into our leadership and really leverage that skill? And first of all, just define it for us. What exactly do we mean by that?
Yeah, so people ask, what's the difference between emotional intelligence and EQ? And EQ would almost be like your IQ. It's what's your emotional quotient in terms of relationships.
Is quotient a funny word?
No, but being interviewed by my sister is a little bit funny, so I am still getting used to this dynamic.
We are very professional here. So.
There will be no laughing on this podcast, Miss Elise Professional Boggs Morales.
She's the funny one in the family. I'm clearly the professor.
The nutty professor. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah. So emotional intelligence, what is it? It's the ability to manage your own emotions and manage the relationships that you have with other people. And if you can't lead or manage yourself well, probably you're not leading and managing other people well. So, that has a lot to do with leadership because a lot of leaders, they get promoted because they're really good at what they do.
Do you not want me to look at you?
She looks so serious.
I'll look at the camera.
Watching me. Leaders get promoted because they're really good at what they do. They're really smart.
I don't know where to look, Professor.
I'm going to look at Jeff. Okay.
I'll close my eyes.
That's usually not
in the middle
solution to be serious.
I'll look at Jeff too. We'll both look at you, Jeff.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so people get promoted into leadership because they're really smart and they're really good at what they do. But leading other people is a totally separate skill set. It's not something that we learn in school unless your major included some kind of communication or conflict resolution or interpersonal communication class. You just didn't learn these skills. And so I think what people expect is, as I move up, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing and people should just follow me. But they lack the skills to build relationships with the people that they lead. So people don't want to follow them. And so there's a real gap. And so emotional intelligence addresses that gap and it makes it super tangible. So it's not like these theoretical things that I can't define. They're very measurable skills that anybody can learn. And it takes really these tiny little tweaks, and all of a sudden you'll notice that your dynamics with other people will really shift very quickly.
Yeah, and I love what you hit on in that just because we bear a certain title or have been put in a certain position, that doesn't mean we're automatically going to have a bunch of loyal followers and we're not going to be necessarily influential leaders just right off the bat. And, I remember working with someone who didn't have the greatest of EQ or emotional intelligence, people skills, and she always struggled so hard in her leadership and was always like, I don't understand why people don't get on board. I don't understand why people don't follow me. And, compassionately looking back, I think it's because of exactly what you're talking about. We're put in positions and we think like, all right, position carries everything, when in reality, position carries nothing. It's who you are. And so help us then, because I think like the fear that we all have is none of us want to end up where you're talking about. Like none of us want to be that. Like I think of Michael Scott right off the bat, I mean, although like you have to love him, he's sweet deep down, but there's just so many like, what are you doing moments where but he's so
relatable because everybody's had a Michael Scott boss.
Everyone's worked for that.
It's funny until you're in it. And then you're like, this is horrible.
Or if you are him by accident, which is my question of like, how, like as leaders, we all have blind spots. Like that's a given. We always will. Like our leadership won't be perfect, but can you kind of walk us through like, how do we avoid being an accidental EQ loser that people are just rolling their eyes when we leave the room, or like just wondering like, why won't that person just get it? Because we all want to do a good job, but we might not all have the skills that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think I'll start with just the fact that we all need to build sources of feedback in our lives, because how do we know how we're coming across unless somebody gives us feedback about that? And sometimes we can even be misinterpreted. We can have the best of intentions. A lot of times we can think, oh, well, I said it like this, but maybe everybody else perceived it a different way. Well, the only way you're hitting the mark is to get feedback. And most leaders think that they should be the givers of feedback, but they don't think they should be the recipients of feedback. And a trap for leaders is that they would get so far removed from good feedback that they're actually making decisions in a vacuum because they haven't tapped into who's on the front line. They haven't discovered how people are perceiving them. They don't know how to read body language. I mean, if people are folding their arms and their eyes are glazing over in a meeting, you're probably not very engaging. But people who just carry on, like a Michael Scott, they're just going to carry on instead of, wait, the room has shifted. People are not engaged. Why is that happening?
So that sounds like an intuitive part of feedback. Like you have to be able to read the room. Is there like something you recommend of an actual feedback tool? Like, is it as simple as asking like, hey, how did I do? Or what do you think of me? Or how is this going? Or how can I be better? Is it just as simple as asking? Or how do you incorporate that habit into your leadership? What does that like tangibly look like?
Well, I think there's probably some official ways to go about it, and then there's some more organic ways. I think the official ways is there's, emotional intelligence assessments out there. There's 360 assessments. For those that aren't familiar with that, that means that, people above you, beside you, and below you all evaluate you in the area of emotional intelligence.
Is that anonymous?
It is anonymous.
Okay.
Yeah, it is anonymous. Although I think people should be willing to own their feedback.
Right.
But that's a whole other discussion.
I'm a little hesitant of anonymous stuff, but I know I get what you're saying. Yeah.
But if it's going to be anonymous, the guidelines that I give are to make sure that that person is getting fair feedback is to make sure that, first of all, the person asking for feedback, that they're getting feedback from people who know them, that have their best interests at heart, and really want to give them feedback to help them, not because they want an opportunity to vent or mischaracterize the person or, whatever, take out their anger. And then, you can guide the people that are giving the feedback to say, this isn't an opportunity to vent. If you haven't actually had this conversation with this person, that's on you. So how can you use this tool to give this person the kind of feedback that's going to help them be a better leader? So there's ways to guide it. So even if it's anonymous, it can be a little bit better quality feedback. But those are some assessments. But then I think feedback should be something that's just ongoing.
Right.
So after you finish a project, hey, how do we think that went? Did you guys feel that I communicated in a way that was clear? Is there anything I could have done better? Is there anything I did do well that I should keep doing? I just think feedback is usually reserved for like once a year reviews.
Right.
But it should actually be
such a formal setting to where, okay, let's sit down and but just incorporating it more into just like, this is our relationship is based on
absolutely
feedback. And so that could be done. Would you say like just a one-on-one conversation of like, hey, Elise, like, you did such a good job on that. Like, was there anything more you needed from me? Or is it like you're addressing the group like, hey, everyone, like, or is it a both and?
I think it's both and. And I think the more you build regular feedback into your culture, the less that becomes a stigma. Because I think if it's this once a year thing, then everything's got to be put into that moment. And what could that mean? What are the negative consequences? But if you've built that into a regular part, and as a leader, you model receptiveness, you model not being defensive, you start making that a part of your culture, I think you'll find that it organically comes up. And if you respond well, people will feel that they can tell you things.
And don't you think too, like that cultivates respect? So all these leaders that are like, I want to be followed, I want to be respected, like that doesn't just come with the birthright of leadership. It's earned. I remember attending a camp and the junior high, Nate Rice, if you're listening, you're awesome. You remember Nate Rice?
Totally.
So we had done this big summer camp obstacle course. And, when you go to a prepackaged camp, the staff just runs it, right?
Right.
And so we're there and the kids had a great time and I'm just like moving kids along from relay to relay and that's all my role is. And everyone had left. And at the end, Nate, who's the camp director, he's like the big dog. I didn't even know he knew like my name or anything. He's like, hey, let's ask her, Kristen, come over here. And he was meeting with his staff and he said, how did you think that relay went? Is there anything that like was a miss or that could have gone better or that was like not super smooth? And I've been to like a million camps and I don't remember a ton, but I remember that moment of like being invited into the conversation and like, wait, me? Like, you want to know what Counselor Kristen thinks about your summer camp soapy relay, like, okay, like, and I had one thing for him. I was like, oh, I thought this would be a little more fun. It just was a little too easy, this one part. And he's like, cool, thank you so much, and it was like, in that moment, like respect was like conceived. And it was just so like, oh my gosh, like, what do I know about Nate Rice? I know that he's an incredible leader based on like a handful of these, conversations. So I think, I love what you're hitting on in that it's, these are the steps that leaders become who they want to be and how they want to be seen.
How do you as a leader go about when you ask for feedback? Because like you're saying, some people might do a vent session, which is not supposed to be, but how do you filter through because I've talked to Kristen about this a lot of times where if you show something, and I'm going to use an analogy that has nothing to do with anything, but track with me. If you were to say, what do you think of this painting I made? Where it's done, there's no changes you can make. People might say, it's fine, it's good, whatever. Could care less. But what if you said, what do you think of this painting? And I can change anything. Well, all of a sudden now they have opportunity to give these changes. Are they giving changes only because they were given the opportunity? Whereas had they not thought about it, would they even think to change it? Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Because I fear sometimes that when you give someone the opportunity to make a judgment or feedback, feeling, not, I don't say they feel forced to say something, but sometimes I feel like, are you saying that because I don't know. What words are
and I
coming
know
right
what
to
you
me?
mean, but I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've had like plenty of times leaders really like, I'll ask them like, hey, what more do you need from me? And they're like, nothing. Like, you're doing great, like whatever. And then sometimes I will get something like, so I don't know. I think it's a personality thing, maybe of like a maturity piece of like, ooh, I just like want to say something or need to say something.
But then how do you filter through? Because they might say something that you're like, I totally don't agree with.
You
that.
just toss that right out. Toss it out.
But then how do you tell a leader, what do you toss and what do you keep? Because some leaders might be like, yeah, give me feedback. I'm tossing it all.
Well, isn't
That's a good question.
something we both learned in ministry is earning the right to be heard.
Yeah.
That not everybody's opinion counts.
You
the same.
weigh, don't count
Yeah.
opinions. And that's why I asked about the anonymous thing, is because sometimes you get a comment and depending on who it is, you're like, pfft. And then sometimes you're like, ooh, I really respect that person. I'm going to listen very carefully to what they have to say on this,
But some people may not have the bravery to do something that with their name on it, where it's like, this really needs to be said, but I'm afraid to put my name on it because now you know that I'm the one who said it.
Well, too bad. I don't know. I feel like we could talk about that for a while, but I just inherently, I don't know, something about that anonymous thing. I think it gives too much freedom.
I think 9 out of 10 times I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
But there is that one circumstance where it's like, if I say this, I might be labeled, that person.
Yeah.
And I might be speaking for the entire group, but I was the one who said it and my name was on it.
Yeah.
And now that leader thinks of me like this in the back of their mind. Okay.
Right.
And they put that on me. It's like, that was everybody, but I can't say it was everybody. So
Yeah, and I guess that's where the 360 does come in handy if there's something that really, really needs to be said, if it's anonymous. So, okay, what else? So you said you have the assessments and then some of it happens organically. Feedback was what we were talking about. What else?
So maybe it would help to kind of talk about what the 4 pillars of emotional intelligence are. And the first one is self-awareness. So how self-aware are you of your strengths, of your weaknesses, of how what you do impacts others? So I should have a pulse on how my actions and what I say, how others receive them. That's self-awareness. Now, an exercise I love to do with people, because we talked about how do you know if you're good at these different things, is I'll have somebody write what they think their top leadership strengths are, what they think their top leadership weaknesses
I like where this
are,
is going.
and then they have to give it to 5 people who they lead. And they
See if they agree.
See if they agree.
That's good.
And I'm telling you, most of the time it doesn't.
Ooh.
Most of the time it doesn't. And to the positive and to the negative. To the positive, they'll say, gosh, I didn't realize that people thought I was good at these things that I didn't even identify for myself.
Okay.
So it's very encouraging. And then other times it's, gosh, I didn't realize I was perceived as bossy or perceived as domineering or a tyrant, or something like that. And that's the first time they're hearing it.
Wow.
So for them to compare their self-perception to the way other people see them, that's that first core skill of self-awareness.
Yeah. And it's so, as you're like light bulbs are going off in my head as you're talking. And I remember having a conversation with one of my interns about someone we were trying to recruit to be a leader. And I was like, I don't understand. Like every time I try to talk to him, like he just shuts down. Like, I don't like, what's going on? She goes, you're really intimidating. I'm like, like, what are you talking about? Like, that is the last word I would ever use to describe myself. And I'm like, what in the world do you mean by that? I said, am I unapproachable? Like, I'm very friendly.
I'm approachable.
Gosh, darn it. No, approach me right now. Approach. But she's like, well, it's like who you are, like in the organization, like people know. And I just never saw myself. And I remember Chris Brown saying, you guys need to realize who you are. But that doesn't register because we're like, we're just us, like whatever. And she was like, no, like, he knew you before you, so you need to be careful. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so weird to see yourself through somebody else's perception and their eyes of like what they see versus like who you actually think you are, and to the different people, like who you are to those you're close with in the organization versus those like that are a little further out on the fringe. You know, you could be two different people to that, or who they perceive you to be. Sure. Anyways. Yeah. That's good. So self-awareness, which is really hard. So so we ask, you know, like, this is who I think I am. Does it match up? And then what?
So that's self-awareness. So I'd say, you know, people who are willing to tell you how you're perceived. And what I think is the easiest thing to correct is perceptions. Because, you know, here's an example of, you know, somebody who maybe sits in a meeting and is super quiet. The perception could be that they're uninterested, that they're not engaged. But if they're an introvert and an internal thinker, they're processing everything going on. And when you tell them that you come off, you know, kind of disengaged, that's an easy perception to correct. So not everything you're going to hear about yourself means that you thought you were this way, but everybody thinks you're that way. It could be that they're perceiving you in a way that you don't intend, and it's giving you the opportunity to correct that. And I think that that's great. And how would you know to correct it without that feedback?
Right.
So you can do all these official assessments, you can have regular times of feedback, and you can simply do that exercise I recommended, which is strengths and weaknesses, give it to people you know, and see how your answers compare with them. But you really can't, the heart of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. You can't do any of the other skills till you kind of have a good sense of that.
And I like that you're encouraging that these are small tweaks, like you said in the beginning, because self-awareness, I guess I've always kind of pictured it as something you either have or you don't. You know, like where did it go? Like when you meet someone who's not very self-aware, you just think, where did that go wrong? But what you're saying is that can be cultivated and that can actually be sharpened in a leader through feedback, right?
I think people are so surprised how quickly they can learn emotional intelligence. I think sometimes it feels like complicated and where do I even start? But honestly, most people I've coached go from 0 to, you know, highly successful as leaders in 6 months or less. And the reason is these tiny little tweaks. They start doing these tiny tweaks that make a big difference, and they're actually able to master it really, really quickly. So that's encouraging.
So what comes after self-awareness?
So after self-awareness comes self-management. Okay. So now that you know yourself, maybe something you also know about yourself is, what are your triggers? When you're around certain kinds of people or certain kinds of situations, what tends to kind of bring up negative emotions for you that you really have to keep in check? Maybe there's other situations. Being self-aware is what makes you really excited or happy or passionate, like connected to your purpose. That's self-awareness. Well, once you know yourself, then you can manage yourself more effectively. Because if I know that when I go into a certain scenario, I get triggered and I tend to have this response, I can start changing the way I handle those situations. Because now I have a pulse on, this is who I am. This is what happens. And instead of reacting, I want to start responding. And so I'm going to start thinking about in advance how I'm going to start responding to these situations rather than just impulsively reacting when it might not be that productive.
That's big. Then that seems like that would come easier maybe over time with discipline and practice, you know, instead of just like being in the moment, preparing for the moment, right? You know, like there is something I dread so much every single week. Oh, and excuse me.
Parenting.
Yes, Jeff, every single day. It's this one thing I have to do every single week. And it's just like, oh, like I start to get anxiety because I know it's like predictable. I know what's going to happen and I know how I'm going to feel and I know how I'm going to respond. But part of what you're saying of that self-management is to like, what would you do? Like, say it was like a really intimidating meeting or something that you had to be a part of, and you knew you were afraid to bring up ideas and that was a trigger for you, and that you kind of shut down. Like, they're not going to respect me. I'm going to look stupid. I want to contribute because I want to appear valuable, but then I don't, because then I know whatever I say is stupid and I'm going to think about it all day. So like, how would you self-manage those triggers? Like, would you have a strategy in there of a challenge for yourself, or what would that be?
Yeah, so this is probably like the most popular part of emotional intelligence, and that is this idea of changing the story. So most people, when they're trying to manage emotions, they have one of two responses. I call them either a reactor, somebody who automatically reacts and ends up having to apologize later because they didn't think, and they maybe said things they shouldn't. And then there's other people that I'd call stuffers, which mean that they don't address things that they should. And so wherever you fall on that spectrum, if you're somebody that's a reactor, it's learning to take a step back before you respond. And I'll talk about that. But if you're a stuffer, it's learning to not just stuff, but say, what is the best way forward? Either addressing the situation, or in some cases, it might be just something you got to work out on your own that never needs to be addressed. But you can't change your reaction to things that trigger you by sheer willpower. That's not going to help you change it. Because you go through, when you get triggered, you go through basically go through 4 little steps. One is you get triggered. Maybe you feel intimidated or whatever, that your ideas aren't going to be heard. Well, that's immediately followed by a thought. My ideas aren't going to be heard. So the meeting is the trigger. My ideas aren't going to be heard. That makes me feel anxious, so I shut down. So your reaction is really hard to change. But if you can change your thought and then change your feeling, the byproduct will be a different reaction. So how do you change the story? Well, I bet you there's somebody that you know that's not intimidated in those meetings. So how do they go into those meetings, and how are they not intimidated? Sometimes I like to hear somebody else's perspective, because what I might be thinking or feeling isn't the truth. And so they can help shed light on it. Or if you're really brave, you could talk to the person you feel intimidated by and say, I want to be able to share ideas, but I'm feeling I'm not quite sure they're going to be received well. Let me know, like, our ideas welcome, because I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing in these meetings. And what they might find is that they're completely welcome. It's just the way that person comes across. So what I like to do to change the story is I'll talk to somebody who doesn't have that trigger in the same area. Or if I'm triggered by a certain person or situation, instead of making assumptions, I'll ask them a lot of questions, because maybe they're going to tell me something about the situation that I misjudged, and then the story completely changes.
Right.
So
you get out of your own head a little bit to hear. I was listening to someone the other day, and she was saying, when you're inside your own head, you convince yourself of so many things and so many stories and so many narratives of like
what everybody's thinking.
Yeah.
And what, before you even walk in the room, you probably already know.
Yeah.
And then when you go in, it confirms everything I
Right.
thought.
That's true.
And I had a really good friend in a meeting that I had weekly, and I was new to the meeting, and I felt so stupid every time. I was like, oh, guy, what's everyone thinking? And if I contributed, I would pull him aside after the meeting. I'd be like, was that so stupid? Like, oh, like, what did you think? And he's like, what are you talking about? Like, it was like I made so much of myself in that. And I was just kind of like, oh, like, yeah, you're kind of just like everyone else in this. Like, no one's super focused on you.
Sure.
It's just like, yeah, you said stuff. Was it good? Was it bad? I don't know. Like, he's like, why are you so
He didn't give it a
freaked
second
out?
thought.
Yeah, he's like, I don't think anyone's going home like replaying what Kristen said in their mind.
But the reality is every single person in that room is probably in some way thinking the same thing you are.
Totally.
Like I used to always think back when I was in junior high, walking into like the school dance, I'd be like concerned about even how I was walking. Like, am I walking normal? Is this a normal way to walk? And I'd go home and like, oh my gosh, I look like such a fool. I probably look like a chicken or, whatever. But in reality, everybody
like,
there was
you
probably...
were at the dance?
Who let him in? But the reality of it is every single person there was probably thinking the exact same thing about themselves.
Right.
And not fitting in or not making sense or,
Right. Kind of off on a tangent.
We never changed. We're still junior hires at heart.
We're still super insecure all the time. Okay, so was that... We wanted to hit 4 pillars of EQ. Was that 3?
That's 2, but we can go through these next 2 super quick.
We don't have to go quick. I just want to make sure we talk
We've
about
got
it.
all night. The kids are asleep.
All night.
So we've talked about self-awareness. I know myself well. When I know myself well, I can manage myself well. And that's the part of emotional intelligence that's all about leading yourself. You really can't lead other people well until you lead yourself well. So that's the foundation. Then the third pillar of EQ is social awareness. So these are things about being able to read a room, being able to pick up on body language, being able to read between the lines. You know, somebody might be saying yes, but if their body language is saying no, it's being able to pick up on that and pay attention. I'd say probably one of the most important qualities of this one is empathy. And empathy is a real buzzword right now. And in the business world, it's making the difference of whether people stay or leave their jobs, is whether they experience a sense of empathy from the person they work for and their team in general. And really, empathy is just a feeling of being connected to other people where you don't feel alone. So if you're going through something, instead of that being dismissed, somebody says to you, that must be really challenging. I can't imagine how hard that must be. Instead of get over it, or that's not a big deal, or you shouldn't let that bother you. People go through this stuff all the time. Like, who are you to react that way? In this world, people do not want to feel alone. So empathy is one of the superpowers of EQ, that if you can be an empathetic person and make somebody feel like the most important person in the world, you will have a lot of leadership influence. So that's this area of social awareness that I think is really important. And so if somebody has the inability, let's say, to read a room, they're probably totally tuned out of their own emotions. And that's why leading yourself is so important first.
Interesting. I like that you gave a real word and like a real action to that practice of social awareness. Like, how simple just to focus on empathy. Like, social awareness, like when you said it, I'm like, whoa, that could be big, like reading a room and everyone in it and what are they thinking and feeling. But if you just lead with that foot of empathy, like what a magnetic draw to leadership, you know, like when you treat people as human. And here's a pet peeve, not that you wanted to know, but one of my pet peeves is when leaders treat people as a means to an end. And when they see them as what they can produce and accomplish for their vision, and they take their humanity out of it. But like when you're like, so speaking specifically to our youth pastors, when your leader comes to you and they need a break, or when they've had a really hard night because the 7th grade boys are being obnoxious, or some parent like came out of nowhere and reamed them, or they were stuck in traffic and had a really hard day at work. And, you know, I can't tell you how many times after youth group, I've been in the parking lot with a leader till 10, 10:30, 10:45. And we're not even talking about ministry anymore. It's like their kid who's struggling in school, and, you know, their boss who's being awful to them, and they're so discouraged. Like, it just, so I think like to pull from what you're talking about, it's like, are we putting ourselves in positions? Are we close enough with the people we lead to even be able to offer empathy? Because I can't offer you empathy if I have no idea what's going on in your life, if I never take the time to have a conversation with you. And I always tell leaders, you know, Elise helped me prepare like a breakout session for a conference. And after talking with you, one of the questions I ask those leaders is, tell me something about the people you lead that happened to them in the last 30 days, not professionally, but personally. Like, what can you tell me about their personal life from the last 30 days? Things, their highs, their lows, their discouragements, things going on with their family, kids, whatever it might be. Where are they going on vacation? But just, do you take the time to talk to them when it's not about ministry, when it's not about business, when it's not about getting things done? Like, are they human to you? And I think people are going to be able to see through that very quickly, whether you see them as a means to an end, or if you see them as like people are it. Like, that's all that matters. Like, our ministries, that's what they're all for, our people. And we can't skip over the people that help us do ministry. Like, they're the most important. So I just like want to hone in on that idea of, are you making yourself even available for the empathy? Because I guess that would come first, of like, am I close enough to even offer that to you? You know what I mean?
Well, leaders want to do more glamorous things, like go to leadership conferences and learn the latest 1, 2, 3 strategy of how to have big vision and how to communicate that. And they come back to their team and they tell them how it's going to be. And the maybe less glamorous side of leadership is something like empathy. And yet it's a superpower.
Thank you for saying glamorous and not sexy. Why do people always say sexy?
Why did you look at me when you said that?
Because you're sexy.
Guilty.
Do you know what I mean, though? When people are like, I know it's not sexy to be empathetic. Like, why did we start doing that? Anyways,
let's
thanks
put an
for
end to
saying
it now.
glamorous. And there I go, bringing it up. But anyways, yeah, it is more glamorous to like, you know, be like working on like big leadership stuff rather than be down here just doing
With the peons.
It's people like you.
Probably true.
But people are not going to follow you to the big stuff if they don't feel connected to you.
Absolutely.
And so empathy is a way to do that.
Right.
And I'd recommend if somebody is unclear about what empathy is, Brene Brown has a YouTube video, and you can just do a search for Brene Brown empathy, and you'll see a fox and a bear, and it's a little animated 2-minute video, and it just perfectly shows what empathy truly is. It's not advice giving. It's not fixing it. It's just being with the person side by side in whatever they're experiencing.
Right.
And I think what you'll find, like I talked about some of the people I coach, empathy is something that we do for them to regain rapport quickly. And some people could say, well, isn't that manipulation? So the difference between doing something like EQ for manipulation or influence, because those are different. When you're doing it for influence, it's a win-win. I win and you win. When it's for manipulation, I'm doing this to get what I want. So there's a winner and a loser.
Right.
So this is all for influence, not manipulation.
Yeah. I'm glad you made that distinction, because you wouldn't want it to be like with insincere
Check empathy.
motives. Right. Absolutely. And I don't know, like if it doesn't come naturally to you, it might be a little forced at the beginning, but if it's coming from the right intentions,
That's right.
it's okay.
It is right.
If it's not like, I'm not naturally empathetic. Hi, Elise, how are you? How was work? And then I could start it, you know, but you have to start somewhere.
It's true. When I worked with the SEALs, the Navy SEALs, they told me, well, what do you do when you don't care? They asked me this question.
Go on.
And, you know, in their line of work, they've had to kind of not care about certain things in order to do their job. I mean, how can they do what they do without that? But I really just believe that anybody can learn it. And like you said, when you start doing the behaviors, this is the cool part about emotional intelligence. You don't have to feel it to do it.
Right.
Just do it. And when the relationship starts improving, it's such a momentum builder that it'll start becoming organically who you are over time.
Do you remember when Michael tried to be friends with Toby? This is what it reminds me of. When he goes in there, he goes,
robotically?
Hey, Toby, I can't do it. I can't do it. And he like walks away. He tries so hard, like, I'm going to be friends with Toby. And then he like, okay, tell me more about that. And it's like, he's like gritting his teeth, you know, but it's like just this great little
Baby steps.
drama
Baby steps.
of like, sometimes it's hard, but yeah. So, okay. So we were socially aware, and then what do we move on to?
The final fourth pillar is relationship management. And these are skills like interpersonal communication and relationships. It's things like coaching and mentoring. It's conflict resolution. It's basically all the skills that involve maintaining and building really good relationships with other people. And again, they all build on each other, because obviously you've led yourself, and now we're going into other people. You've learned to read them well so that you can manage the relationship well. So that's the final pillar.
And there was something you said like before we recorded about like all these, I think it kind of ties up what you're saying a little bit with the bow, is like principles and do not equal power.
Yep.
But it's relationship building. So maybe like
talk about that.
Yeah, like integrate that a little bit into what you just said.
Well, I think like I've worked with leaders in every industry. So you talked about I was in ministry, full-time ministry for a long time, working with college students and then pastors and leaders. And then I've worked internationally. And I've worked in almost every industry, and it doesn't matter whether it's ministry. It doesn't matter if it's marketplace. It doesn't even matter culturally. The same principle applies no matter what. And that is that we can't become better leaders necessarily by knowing more. because we can go to these conferences again and learn all these leadership principles. I mean, I got my master's in leadership and all of those principles are great. But if you don't have the relationship building skills, which EQ teaches you, then all of those principles have no power. But when you have those leadership principles and you couple them with EQ, not only do you have total clarity for where to lead people, but the people want to come with you. And so that's often the missing piece. And people can't understand, gosh, I've gone to all these conferences. I've read every John Maxwell book, and I'm doing everything it's telling me to do.
People just don't like you.
Right?
I'm sorry. It's just no conference can teach you how to be a likable person.
It's true, but EQ teaches you how to be likable.
Absolutely.
And people never, like you said earlier, people do not follow a position. They follow the person.
Right.
And this is how to create that connection.
One thing one of my leaders said to me once, we were going through a really, really hard season in our ministry, and it was like I worked at a minimum security prison for juveniles. Every time I went to work, I'm like, where am I? This is horrible. And my poor leaders were just like dragged through the mud, and these kids were just getting abusive. Listen to our episode about the wolves among the sheep, because that was just where we were at. It was awful. And one of my leaders, I was just like, guys, thank you so much for hanging in there with me. Like, I promise it'll get better. Like, I don't know why we're going through this. We just got to hang on. And one of them, I'll never forget, this was the best thing a leader had ever said to me. She's like, Kristen, we'll follow you anywhere. And I'm like, even saying it right now, getting a little choked up. Hannah, if you're listening, I love you. And it was just in that moment, like, I get the chills, because in that moment, I realized all of the stuff we did in the good season, where it was just normal day in, day out relationship and pouring into people and, listening and the empathy and all that stuff carried us through when things got really heavy and really hard. And so, like, for leaders, I think just what this builds into a team of everything you're talking about is loyalty and those like ride or die people that, when you said they're not following a position, it's like, well, Kristen's the pastor, so we're the leaders and this is what we do. But it was like, we were just so bonded that we were like arm in arm, like, we're doing this, like, come hell or high water. And they both came. It was like, we are going to do this together because we believe in you. We believe in your leadership. We believe in this mission. And those were the times that all of that hard work of all this EQ stuff, and I say hard, it, after a while, it's just second nature kind of stuff, but it carries you through those hard times.
Well, what you're talking about, and I don't know if you guys have heard this term, is this idea of relational equity. That, you think about equity in a house or whatever, it's that there's enough value in there to carry you through. And what people don't realize is it's these tiny, little, seemingly insignificant interactions day in and day out that are making deposits into a relational bank account. So with your leaders, you were making constant deposits. And then when the hard season came, you had enough money in that account to write a check that would actually not bounce, meaning people leave, they're disengaged, this is too hard, I'm leaving. And I think that is what these skills of emotional intelligence give us, is relational equity, that when we're really sewing in to relationships during the good times, then when the bad times come, people stick with us. It's a loyalty that nobody can take away from us. And so I think what you're talking about is exactly that.
Ooh, that's good. That's a good place to end. And we do actually have one more fun question for you. Jeff,
ready?
Yes. So we always ask our guests a question, one of three, and we're going to ask you, who is your celebrity lookalike?
My sister and I have one shared one. Remember? Scarlett Johansson.
Oh, yes.
Like Scarlett this part of our face we heard both when we worked at the same restaurant. Remember that?
So I filmed a wedding with him a while ago, and this guy comes up to me and he goes, you look exactly like Scarlett Johansson.
He was talking to me.
He goes, and I love Scarlett Johansson.
Get out of here, you creep. Go back back to your bride. You just got married.
Wasn't the bride. I mean the groom. Okay, so who?
But the one that I've gotten a lot personally is for those people that have seen My Girl is Anna. We've been practicing how to say her name. Klumsky. Anna Klumsky from My Girl.
Yes. So if you're a youth pastor who's like 22 or below, probably not below, but you're like, what the heck is My Girl? So Macaulay Culkin gets stung by bees. Spoiler alert. No, Macaulay Culkin and Anna Klumsky. It's this adorable little like romance
For kids.
I know I was gonna say child romance, but then it started sounding
It's
weird.
like puppy love.
Yeah. It's super cute, called My Girl. So Google image search Anna Klumsky, but it's spelled Chlumsky. Anyways, so Google image search, that's what Elise, she posted a picture once of Anna Klumsky and people thought it was her.
That's right.
On her social media. But so how funny is this? Youth pastors who do remember My Girl, Macaulay Culkin tweeted the other day and he said, "Hey, do you want to feel old? ... I'm 40. I'm like, oh my gosh.
No, he's the kid from Home Alone. He's not 40.
I mean, Anna. Macaulay Culkin is 40 years old. That's crazy. Where did her childhood go, guys?
Well, Elise, where can people connect with you? Give them all the websites, Instagrams, and all that stuff.
Yeah. So eliseboggs.com is my website. And then my Instagram handle is The Whole Leadership. So you can catch me in either of those places.
Like there's a hole in your leadership or the
whole
whole
leadership.
with a W.
With a W. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah.
Well, make sure you guys give her a follow and you can get consistent tips on how you can improve your EQ. And we will see you guys next time.